Case 1. Jung Myung Seok. The courtroom fell silent as the 78-year-old man in handcuffs shuffled toward the defendant's chair, his once commanding presence now reduced to a frail shadow of the religious empire he had built. This was February 16, 2023, and Jung Myung-seok, the man who had convinced over 100,000 followers across the globe that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ, was about to receive an additional 23 years in prison for sexual assault. The judge's voice cut through the tension as he delivered the verdict that would ensure Jung would die behind bars. But this wasn't his first conviction. This wasn't even his second. For over 3 decades, Jung had used his divine claims to systematically rape and sexually assault hundreds of young women, telling them that submitting to his desires was their pathway to salvation. Jung Myung-seok's transformation from small-town Korean farm boy to self-proclaimed Messiah began in the 1970s when he claimed to receive divine revelations that positioned him as God's chosen successor to Jesus Christ. Born in 1945 in rural South Korea, Jung initially appeared to be a devout Christian who studied theology and showed genuine religious passion, but behind his spiritual facade, he was already developing the psychological manipulation techniques that would later destroy thousands of lives. His religious movement, officially called the Christian Gospel Mission but commonly known as JMS, Jesus Morning Star, attracted followers through Jung's charismatic preaching and claims of supernatural abilities. He taught that Jesus Christ's earthly mission was incomplete and that he, Jung Myung-seok, had been chosen by God to finish the work of salvation. This doctrine provided the theological foundation for his systematic abuse, as he convinced followers that their spiritual salvation depended entirely on absolute obedience to his divine authority. The organization grew rapidly throughout the 1980s and 1990s, establishing branches in over 30 countries and recruiting primarily among young university students who were seeking meaning and spiritual purpose. Jung's followers, known as Providence members, were taught that their leader possessed perfect spiritual insight and that questioning his commands was tantamount to rejecting God himself. This psychological conditioning created the perfect environment for sexual exploitation disguised as religious practice. Jung's method was as calculated as it was devastating. He would select the most devoted female followers, isolate them in private, spiritual counseling sessions, and then convince them that sexual acts with him were sacred rituals that would purify their souls and guarantee their place in heaven. Those who resisted were told they lacked faith. Those who complied were sworn to secrecy through religious manipulation that convinced them speaking out would damn their eternal souls. For decades, Jung evaded justice through international flight, hiding in China while his victims struggled with trauma and his organization continued recruiting new targets. When authorities finally captured him in 2007, the investigation revealed a global network of abuse that had destroyed thousands of lives, while generating millions of dollars in donations from sincere believers who thought they were supporting divine ministry. But Jung's story is just the beginning of a global epidemic that reveals how religious authority has been weaponized by predators who exploit humanity's deepest spiritual needs for their own twisted desires. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the darkest secrets of those who abuse power and betray the trust of innocent people seeking spiritual guidance. If you love true crime documentaries that reveal shocking truths about corruption and abuse, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because we're bringing you the investigations that others won't touch. Case 2. Robert Martin Gumbura, the Prosperity Predator. Robert Martin Gumbura commanded immense respect throughout Zimbabwe. As the founder of RMG Ministry, a charismatic church that promised financial breakthrough and divine prosperity to thousands of followers struggling with poverty in one of Africa's most economically challenged nations. His polished appearance, expensive suits, and fleet of luxury vehicles served as living testimony to the prosperity gospel he preached, convincing desperate believers that faithful giving and absolute obedience to his spiritual authority would unlock God's financial blessings in their own lives. Gumbura's background as a successful businessman before entering ministry provided credibility that distinguished him from other religious leaders who lacked tangible evidence of God's favor. His testimony about divine calling to leave lucrative secular career for full-time ministry resonated powerfully with followers who viewed his sacrifice as proof of authentic spiritual commitment. This perceived authenticity became the foundation for trust that he would systematically exploit for criminal purposes. His ministry empire included multiple church locations, a Bible college, and various business ventures that generated substantial income while positioning Gumbura as both spiritual and financial authority within his community. The prosperity doctrine he preached emphasized that material wealth was evidence of spiritual favor, creating theological framework that justified his luxurious lifestyle, while simultaneously pressuring followers to give sacrificially despite their own financial hardships. The church attracted primarily women, many of whom were single mothers or wives of unemployed men seeking divine intervention in their desperate economic circumstances. Gumbura's promises of financial breakthrough and spiritual empowerment appealed particularly to vulnerable women who saw his ministry as their only hope for escaping poverty and achieving the prosperity that seemed forever beyond their reach through conventional means. But behind his prosperity preaching and community leadership lay predatory behavior that targeted the most vulnerable women within his congregation for systematic sexual exploitation. Gumbura used his spiritual authority and promises of special divine favor to isolate and assault women who trusted him as their pastor and spiritual father. His methodology involved convincing victims that sexual submission to his authority was necessary a requirement for receiving the financial blessings they desperately needed. The criminal pattern typically began with Gumbura identifying financially desperate women within his congregation and offering them special counseling sessions or ministry opportunities that required private meetings. During these encounters, he would gradually introduce sexual contact while using theological manipulation to convince victims that physical intimacy with him was divinely ordained and essential for unlocking God's prosperity in their lives. Gumbura's manipulation was particularly effective because his victims were not only spiritually vulnerable, but also economically desperate, making them reluctant to risk losing access to the financial assistance and community support that his church provided. Many victims endured ongoing sexual assault because they believed that reporting their pastor's crimes would result in losing their only source of hope for economic improvement and spiritual guidance. The investigation began when 4 brave women overcame cultural stigma and religious pressure to report Gumbura's systematic sexual abuse to Zimbabwe authorities. Their testimonies revealed consistent pattern of spiritual manipulation combined with sexual assault that had been occurring for several years while Gumbura maintained his public image as moral leader and prosperity teacher. Police investigation uncovered additional evidence, including pornographic material found in Gumbura's possession, which violated both criminal law and the moral standards he publicly preached to his congregation. The discovery of this material provided corroborating evidence about his predatory mindset, while contradicting his claims of spiritual purity and divine authority that he used to justify his leadership position. The trial became highly publicized throughout Zimbabwe as the prosperity gospel movement faced scrutiny about accountability and the potential for spiritual authority to be abused for criminal purposes. Gumbura's defense attempted to discredit his accusers by questioning their motives and suggesting they were seeking financial compensation rather than justice. But the consistency of victim testimony and physical evidence made his guilt undeniable. The court conviction on 4 counts of rape represented a landmark case in Zimbabwe's legal system, demonstrating that religious leaders would be held accountable for criminal behavior regardless of their spiritual claims or community standing. The judge's decision to impose a 40-year sentence, reduced from an initial 50 years, sent clear message that sexual abuse by religious leaders would receive severe punishment commensurate with the profound betrayal of trust involved. The downfall destroyed not only Gombora's ministry but also created crisis within Zimbabwe's prosperity gospel movement as believers questioned the authenticity of religious leaders who preached material success while exploiting vulnerable followers. His conviction forced other pastors to implement accountability measures, while congregations became more skeptical of claims about divine authority and special spiritual revelation. Case 3. Bajinder Singh. Bajinder Singh built his reputation as a compassionate spiritual leader through decades of community service in rural India, where his humble demeanor and dedication to helping the poor earned him widespread respect among local families, who viewed him as a genuine man of God. His background included extensive charitable work, religious education, and consistent involvement in community development projects that improved the lives of countless villagers who had few other sources of support or guidance. Singh's ministry operated within India's complex religious landscape where spiritual authorities traditionally command enormous respect and influence over personal decisions affecting marriage, family relationships, and moral conduct. His position as a religious leader provided him with access to families' most private concerns and intimate struggles, creating opportunities for counseling and guidance that required absolute trust and vulnerability from those seeking his help. The community's faith in Singh was reinforced by his apparent lifestyle of simplicity and sacrifice, as he lived modestly while dedicating his time and resources to serving others without obvious personal gain. This perceived authenticity distinguished him from religious leaders who displayed wealth or self-promotion, making his moral authority even more compelling to followers who believed his humility demonstrated genuine spiritual maturity and divine calling. His influence extended particularly strongly among women in the community, who sought his guidance on family issues, marital problems, and spiritual questions that traditional patriarchal structures often left unaddressed. Singh's willingness to listen compassionately to women's concerns and provide seemingly wise counsel made him a trusted confidant for female congregants who had few other sources of understanding and support. But behind his reputation for compassion and spiritual wisdom lay calculated predatory behavior targeting vulnerable women who came to him seeking legitimate spiritual guidance and pastoral care. Singh systematically exploited the trust and authority his position provided to identify and assault women who were emotionally vulnerable due to personal crises, marital difficulties, or spiritual confusion that made them dependent on his counsel. His criminal methodology involved using legitimate counseling sessions as opportunities to gradually introduce inappropriate physical contact disguised as spiritual ministry. Singh would convince victims that physical intimacy with him was necessary for their spiritual purification or divine healing, using religious terminology and scriptural references to make his assault seem like sacred ritual rather than criminal exploitation. The manipulation was particularly effective within India's cultural context, where religious authorities are traditionally viewed as beyond question and where women face enormous social pressure to maintain silence about sexual assault, especially when committed by respected community leaders. Singh exploited these cultural dynamics to ensure his victims remained silent while he continued targeting additional women within his sphere of influence. The case that led to Singh's conviction involved repeated sexual assault of a female congregant who had initially sought his help with personal and spiritual struggles. Over an extended period, Singh used his position of trust and spiritual authority to coerce ongoing sexual contact while convincing the victim that resistance would demonstrate lack of faith and result in spiritual consequences that could affect her family's well-being. The victim's decision to report Singh's crimes required extraordinary courage, given the social stigma surrounding sexual assault accusations against religious leaders in Indian society. Her testimony revealed systematic pattern of spiritual manipulation combined with repeated rape that had continued for months while Singh maintained his public facade as moral leader and community servant. The investigation faced significant challenges due to cultural pressure to protect religious authorities and community reluctance to believe that a respected spiritual leader could commit such crimes. However, the victim's detailed testimony and corroborating evidence eventually convinced authorities that Singh had systematically abused his position to commit serious criminal offenses against someone who had trusted him for spiritual guidance. Singh's defense attempted to characterize the sexual contact as consensual relationship between adults, but prosecutors successfully demonstrated that his position of spiritual authority and the victim's vulnerable emotional state made genuine consent impossible. The court recognized that religious leaders who exploit their authority for sexual purposes commit particularly serious crimes that betray fundamental trust relationships essential for community spiritual life. The 2025 conviction that resulted in life imprisonment represented a landmark case in India's legal system, where prosecutions of religious leaders for sexual assault remain relatively rare due to cultural deference to spiritual authority. The severe sentence demonstrated judicial recognition that abuse of religious position constitutes an aggravating factor that justifies enhanced punishment beyond that imposed for assault by ordinary citizens. Case 4. Michael Olorunbi. Michael Olorunbi arrived in the United Kingdom from Nigeria with impressive credentials and a compelling testimony about divine calling to establish authentic Christian ministry among immigrant communities seeking spiritual guidance and cultural connection in their new homeland. His charismatic preaching style and apparent theological knowledge quickly attracted followers who viewed him as a gifted leader capable of building genuine spiritual community that honored both biblical principles and African cultural heritage. Olorunbi's background included claimed seminary education and ministry experience in Nigeria, credentials that provided credibility within UK immigrant communities where authentic spiritual leadership was highly valued and difficult to verify. His ability to speak multiple languages and understand the unique challenges facing African families adjusting to British society made him particularly appealing to vulnerable populations seeking both spiritual guidance and practical support. His Cherubim and Seraphim Church in Birmingham became a gathering place for dozens of families who trusted Olorunbi as their spiritual father and moral authority. The church provided not only religious services but also community support, cultural connection, and practical assistance that made it an essential institution for immigrants who had few other sources of guidance and belonging in their new environment. Olorunbi's ministry particularly attracted families with children, as parents sought a religious leader who could provide moral instruction and spiritual guidance that would help their young people navigate British culture while maintaining African values and Christian faith. His reputation as family-friendly pastor who understood both cultures made him trusted confidant for parents who granted him significant access to their children and family decisions. But behind his ministerial facade and community leadership lay systematic, predatory behavior that targeted both adult women and minors within his congregation for sexual exploitation spanning several years. Olorunbi used his position of trust and spiritual authority to identify vulnerable victims among families who viewed him as divinely appointed leader, whose guidance was essential for their spiritual and practical well-being. His criminal methodology involved grooming victims through legitimate pastoral interactions that gradually became inappropriate physical contact, disguised as spiritual ministry or counseling. Olorunbi convinced victims that sexual submission to his authority was a requirement for receiving divine blessings and spiritual advancement, while threatening that resistance would result in spiritual consequences, affecting their family's well-being and community standing. The abuse included systematic assault of minors whose parents had entrusted them to Olorunbi's spiritual care and mentorship. His exploitation of children was particularly devastating because it violated not only criminal law, but also the sacred trust that African families traditionally place in religious leaders who are expected to protect and guide young people with absolute moral integrity. Olorunbi's manipulation was enhanced by cultural dynamics within immigrant communities where challenging religious authority was viewed as both spiritually dangerous and socially disruptive. His victims faced enormous pressure to remain silent about his crimes due to fear of community ostracism, family shame, and potential consequences for their immigration status and social support networks. The investigation began when multiple victims overcame cultural pressure and personal trauma to report Olaronbi's systematic abuse to British authorities. Their testimonies revealed a consistent pattern of sexual exploitation that had been occurring for years, while Olaronbi maintained his public image as moral leader and family advocate within the immigrant community. Police investigation uncovered evidence of 15 counts of rape, 7 counts of indecent assault, and 2 counts of sexual assault involving multiple victims ranging from children to adult women. The systematic nature of his crimes and the extended period over which they occurred demonstrated calculated predatory behavior rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or moral failure. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that Olaronbi had systematically exploited his position of trust and spiritual authority to commit serious sexual offenses against vulnerable congregation members who had trusted him as their pastor and spiritual guide. His defense attempts to minimize the charges or question victim credibility failed when confronted with consistent testimony and corroborating evidence. The 2020 conviction on all charges resulted in a 34-year prison sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes and the profound betrayal of trust involved in sexual abuse by religious leaders. The court recognized that Olaronbi had systematically exploited the most vulnerable members of his community while hiding behind spiritual authority that made his crimes particularly difficult for victims to report or escape. The downfall destroyed not only Olaronbi's ministry but also created lasting trauma within Birmingham's Nigerian Christian community as families struggled with guilt about having trusted their children and personal well-being to someone who had systematically betrayed that trust for criminal purposes. Many congregation members required extensive counseling and support to process the complex trauma of discovering that their spiritual father was actually a predator. Case 5. Tony Alamo. Tony Alamo's transformation from street evangelist to polygamist cult leader began in the 1960s when he and his wife Susan established Tony Alamo Christian Ministries in Hollywood, California, initially focusing on reaching drug addicts and runaways with a message of salvation and redemption. Their early ministry appeared genuinely compassionate as they provided food, shelter, and rehabilitation services to society's most vulnerable populations who had been abandoned by traditional institutions and religious organizations. Alamo's charismatic personality and dramatic conversion testimony resonated powerfully with young people seeking meaning and purpose during the cultural upheaval of the 1960s and 1970s. His ability to communicate with street people and outcasts, combined with his wife Susan's organizational skills, created a ministry that attracted hundreds of followers who viewed the Alamos as prophetic voices capable of providing authentic spiritual guidance in an increasingly secular world. Following Susan's death from cancer in 1982, Tony Alamo's ministry took increasingly radical direction as he began teaching controversial doctrines about end-times prophecy, government persecution, and the need for absolute separation from mainstream society. His followers established isolated compounds in Arkansas and other rural locations where they lived communally under Alamo's complete authority while engaging in various business enterprises that generated substantial income for the organization. Alamo's theological innovations included claims that he was a prophet with direct revelation from God, that mainstream Christianity had been corrupted, and that only his followers would survive the coming apocalypse. These teachings created psychological dependency among members, who believed their eternal salvation depended entirely on maintaining absolute loyalty to Alamo's leadership and complete separation from outside influences that might undermine their faith. But behind his prophetic claims and religious authority lay systematic sexual exploitation that included polygamous relationships with multiple wives, some of whom were minors when their spiritual marriages to Alamo began. His methodology involved identifying young girls within the compound community and gradually grooming them for sexual relationships disguised as divinely ordained marriages that were essential for their spiritual development and eternal salvation. Alamo's criminal behavior was facilitated by the isolated nature of his compounds, where external oversight was minimal and internal dissent was suppressed through religious manipulation and threats of spiritual consequences. Children born into the community were raised with no exposure to outside perspectives that might have provided them with understanding of normal boundaries or legal protections against sexual abuse. The systematic abuse included transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes, as Alamo moved his wives between different compound locations to avoid detection while continuing his exploitation. His organization's business operations provided cover for this criminal activity while generating revenue that funded his luxurious lifestyle and enabled him to maintain control over hundreds of followers who provided free labor for his enterprises. Alamo's manipulation extended beyond sexual exploitation to include systematic control over every aspect of his followers' lives, including their finances, relationships, education, and communication with the outside world. Members were required to turn over all personal assets to the ministry, while working without compensation in Alamo's businesses that included clothing manufacturing, construction, and agricultural operations. The investigation intensified in the late 2000s when former members began speaking publicly about systematic abuse within Alamo's organization, providing authorities with detailed information about criminal activities that had been occurring for decades behind the facade of religious community. Their testimonies revealed a pattern of sexual exploitation, child abuse, and financial fraud that constituted ongoing criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate ministry. FBI raids on Alamo's Arkansas compound in September 2008 uncovered evidence of systematic child abuse and sexual exploitation spanning multiple decades. The investigation revealed that Alamo had been marrying girls as young as 9 years old, while teaching that these relationships were divinely ordained and essential for the girls' spiritual salvation and the community's survival. The federal prosecution focused on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes, charges that carried potential life imprisonment due to the systematic nature of Alamo's crimes and the number of victims involved. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence that Alamo had systematically exploited his religious authority to commit serious federal crimes against children who had been entrusted to his spiritual care. The 2009 conviction resulted in a 175-year prison sentence that ensured Alamo would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated for his crimes. The court recognized that his systematic abuse of religious authority to exploit children constituted particularly serious criminal behavior that warranted the maximum possible punishment under federal sentencing guidelines. Alamo's death in federal prison in 2017 ended his reign of terror, but could not undo the devastating impact his crimes had on hundreds of victims who spent years recovering from the complex trauma of religious and sexual abuse. Many former members required extensive psychological treatment to overcome the systematic conditioning that had convinced them Alamo's exploitation was divinely ordained rather than criminal behavior. The collapse of Tony Alamo Christian Ministries eliminated a dangerous cult that had operated for decades while providing important precedent for federal prosecution of religious leaders who exploit their authority for criminal purposes, demonstrating that claims of religious freedom cannot shield predators from accountability for systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. Case 6. Stephen Garasai Tari. Stephen Garasai Tari emerged from Papua New Guinea's remote highlands claiming divine revelation that positioned him as the exclusive pathway to salvation for followers seeking spiritual truth in one of the world's most isolated and culturally diverse regions. His background combined traditional Melanesian spiritual practices with Christian theology, creating syncretic religious movement that appealed to indigenous populations struggling to balance ancestral beliefs with introduced Christianity. Tari's ministry operated in extremely remote areas of Papua New Guinea, where government oversight was minimal and traditional authority structures created environments where charismatic leaders could establish virtually autonomous communities. His ability to speak multiple local languages and understand tribal customs made him a compelling figure for indigenous people seeking spiritual guidance that honored their cultural heritage while promising access to divine power. His religious movement attracted followers primarily from rural villages where poverty, limited education, and geographic isolation created conditions where prophetic claims and promises of supernatural intervention held particular appeal. Tari's teachings combined biblical prophecy with traditional spiritual practices, creating a religious system that seemed familiar to indigenous followers, while positioning him as a uniquely gifted spiritual leader with access to divine revelation. The organization established isolated compound communities in jungle locations that were virtually inaccessible to outside authorities or oversight organizations. These remote settlements provided perfect environment for systematic abuse while maintaining facade of legitimate religious community engaged in subsistence agriculture and spiritual development activities that appeared harmless to casual observers. Tari's theological innovations included claims that he possessed supernatural healing powers, prophetic abilities, and direct communication with divine forces that required absolute obedience from followers seeking spiritual benefits. His teachings emphasized that salvation and material prosperity depended entirely on maintaining complete loyalty to his authority while following his guidance about personal relationships, family decisions, and community participation. But behind his spiritual claims and prophetic authority lay systematic sexual exploitation, targeting the youngest and most vulnerable female followers within his isolated communities. Tari used his position of absolute authority and the remote locations of his compounds to assault women and girls who had no means of escape or outside support to help them resist his predatory behavior. His criminal methodology involved identifying young women within the compound communities and convincing them that sexual submission to his authority was a requirement for receiving divine blessings and spiritual advancement. The isolation of his compounds meant that victims had no access to outside perspectives that might have helped them understand that Tari's demands were criminal exploitation rather than legitimate spiritual practices. The manipulation was enhanced by Papua New Guinea's traditional cultural patterns, where female autonomy was limited and challenging male authority was viewed as socially disruptive. Tari exploited these cultural dynamics to convince victims that resistance to his sexual demands would result in spiritual consequences affecting not only themselves, but also their families and communities that depended on his leadership. The investigation faced enormous challenges due to the remote locations of Tari's compounds and the limited resources available to Papua New Guinea authorities for conducting complex criminal investigations in isolated jungle areas. Communication difficulties, transportation challenges, and cultural barriers complicated efforts to gather evidence and interview potential victims who had been isolated from outside contact. Despite these obstacles, authorities eventually received reports about systematic sexual abuse within Tari's organization from former members who had managed to escape the compound communities and reach populated areas where they could contact police. Their testimonies revealed a pattern of sexual exploitation that had been occurring for years, while Tari maintained absolute control over his followers through religious manipulation and geographic isolation. The breakthrough in the case came when multiple victims provided consistent testimony about Tari's systematic abuse of young women within the compound communities. Their accounts revealed that sexual assault was not an isolated incident, but ongoing pattern of exploitation that was integral to Tari's exercise of authority and control over his religious movement. The prosecution faced unique challenges in presenting evidence from such remote and culturally distinct communities, requiring extensive translation services and cultural interpretation to help court understand the context in which Tari's crimes had occurred. Despite these complexities, the evidence of systematic sexual abuse was overwhelming and undeniable. The 2010 conviction on multiple counts of rape resulted in a 20-year prison sentence that reflected both the severity of Tari's crimes and the practical limitations of Papua New Guinea's criminal justice system. However, The story took dramatic turn when Tari escaped from custody and fled into the jungle, leading to manhunt that ultimately ended with his death while attempting to evade recapture. Tari's death in custody after his recapture eliminated the possibility of completing his prison sentence, but could not undo the trauma he had inflicted on dozens of victims who remained in remote communities with limited access to psychological support or rehabilitation services. His compound communities dissolved following his conviction, leaving former followers to rebuild their lives while processing the complex trauma of religious and sexual abuse. Case 7. Jae-rock Lee. Jae-rock Lee commanded unprecedented influence as senior pastor of Manmin Central Church in Seoul, South Korea. Building one of the world's largest megachurches with over 130,000 members while claiming supernatural healing powers that attracted international attention. From Christian leaders seeking to understand his apparent miraculous ministry, his elaborate healing services, broadcast globally through television and internet, featured dramatic testimonies of divine intervention that convinced millions of viewers he possessed authentic supernatural abilities. Lee's background included decades of ministry development that transformed him from obscure pastor into international religious celebrity whose healing crusades filled massive stadiums throughout Asia, Africa, and South America. His organization published books, produced television programs, and established satellite churches worldwide, while generating enormous revenue through donations from believers who viewed his ministry as legitimate manifestation of divine power in the modern world. His theological teachings emphasized that complete faith and absolute obedience to his spiritual authority were prerequisites for receiving divine healing and supernatural breakthrough. Lee taught that he served as God's exclusive representative on earth, and that questioning his methods or authority demonstrated spiritual rebellion that would prevent believers from accessing the miraculous intervention they desperately needed for health, financial, and relationship problems. The church's elaborate healing services featured carefully orchestrated productions where Lee would claim to heal everything from cancer to paralysis through prayer and laying on of hands. These events attracted desperate people from around the world who had exhausted medical options and viewed Lee's supernatural claims as their final hope for miraculous intervention that could transform their circumstances through divine power. Lee's influence extended beyond his immediate congregation to include relationships with government officials, business leaders, and international religious figures who sought his counsel and blessing for their endeavors. His political connections and economic influence made him virtually untouchable within South Korean society, where challenging his authority seemed both spiritually dangerous and socially impossible. But behind his healing ministry and supernatural claims lay systematic sexual exploitation that targeted female church members through manipulation involving claims that physical intimacy with him was divinely ordained and essential for receiving the spiritual benefits they sought. Lee's methodology involved convincing victims that sexual submission to his authority was a sacred act that would unlock God's healing power and supernatural intervention in their lives. His criminal behavior was particularly insidious because it exploited the desperate faith of women who had come to him seeking divine healing for serious medical conditions or family crises. Lee convinced these vulnerable victims that sexual contact with him was spiritual medicine prescribed by God, and that resistance would demonstrate lack of faith that would prevent their healing and potentially result in divine judgment. The manipulation was sophisticated and systematic, involving private counseling sessions where Lee would gradually introduce sexual contact while using theological language and scriptural references to make his assaults seem like sacred ritual rather than criminal exploitation. His victims were sworn to absolute secrecy through religious manipulation that convinced them speaking out would damn their souls and prevent God's healing intervention. Lee's crimes remained hidden for decades due to the enormous respect he commanded within Korean society and the cultural reluctance to challenge religious authority, especially when combined with his apparent supernatural abilities that seemed to validate his divine calling. His victims faced overwhelming pressure to remain silent due to fear of spiritual consequences and social ostracism within communities that viewed Lee as authentic prophet. The breakthrough came during South Korea's Me Too movement, when changing cultural attitudes about sexual abuse empowered victims to speak publicly about experiences they had previously been unable to report. Multiple women came forward with detailed testimonies about Lee's systematic sexual exploitation disguised as spiritual ministry, providing consistent accounts that revealed decades of predatory behavior. The investigation revealed that Lee had assaulted numerous women over many years while maintaining his public image as moral leader and divine healer. His victims included church members who had sought his help for medical conditions, personal problems, and spiritual guidance, only to discover that his offer of divine intervention came with criminal demands for sexual submission. The prosecution faced enormous challenges in Korean society, where Lee's religious influence and apparent supernatural abilities created presumption of innocence that made many citizens reluctant to believe he could commit such crimes. However, the consistency of victim testimony and corroborating evidence eventually overcame cultural resistance and religious prejudice that had protected Lee for decades. The 2018 conviction on multiple counts of rape resulted in a 15-year prison sentence that shocked Korean religious communities and created crisis within Lee's massive church organization. The court's recognition that his claims of divine authority provided no defense for criminal sexual assault established important legal precedent for holding religious leaders accountable regardless of their spiritual claims or community influence. The downfall destroyed Lee's healing ministry and created profound crisis within Manmin Central Church as 130,000 members struggled to understand how someone they believed possessed authentic divine power could systematically commit such serious crimes. Many congregation members experienced spiritual trauma that required extensive counseling, while others abandoned faith entirely after discovering their trusted spiritual leader was actually a predator. Case 8. Bafomba Willie Emeka. Bafomba Willie established himself as a respected community leader in South Africa's Eastern Cape Province, building a reputation through extensive charitable work and passionate preaching that addressed the spiritual and practical needs of families struggling with poverty, unemployment, and social challenges that plagued post-apartheid communities seeking hope and transformation through authentic religious guidance and community development. Emeka's ministry emerged during South Africa's democratic transition, when communities were searching for new forms of leadership that could bridge racial divisions while providing moral guidance for navigating complex social changes. His ability to speak multiple languages and understand diverse cultural backgrounds made him an appealing figure for congregations seeking inclusive religious leadership that honored traditional African spirituality while embracing Christian faith. His church attracted primarily women from economically disadvantaged backgrounds who viewed Emeka as a compassionate leader, capable of understanding their struggles with domestic violence, financial hardship, and family challenges that government services and social programs were inadequate to address. These vulnerable women trusted Emeka as spiritual father who could provide both practical assistance and divine intervention for their desperate circumstances. The congregation's faith in Emeka was reinforced by his apparent dedication to community service and his willingness to provide financial assistance, counseling, and advocacy for church members facing legal problems, housing issues, and employment discrimination. His reputation for helping vulnerable families created enormous trust and loyalty among followers, who viewed him as authentic servant leader rather than self-promoting religious entrepreneur. Emeka's ministry operated within South Africa's complex religious landscape, where traditional healing practices, ancestral spirituality, and Christian theology often combined to create syncretic religious systems that provided culturally relevant spiritual guidance for communities seeking to maintain African identity while embracing modern religious practices and social development opportunities. But behind his community leadership and charitable reputation lay systematic predatory behavior targeting the most vulnerable women within his congregation for sexual exploitation spanning several years. Between 2015 and 2018, Emeka used his position of trust and spiritual authority to assault 5 different women who had sought his help with personal crises, family problems, and spiritual guidance. His criminal methodology involved identifying women who were particularly vulnerable due to domestic violence, financial desperation, or family emergencies that made them dependent on his assistance and emotional support. Emeka would offer special counseling sessions or private ministry meetings that provided opportunities for him to gradually introduce inappropriate physical contact, disguised as spiritual healing or prayer ministry. The manipulation was particularly effective within South African cultural context, where challenging religious authority was viewed as spiritually dangerous and socially disruptive, especially for women who were already marginalized by poverty and limited educational opportunities. Emeka exploited these cultural dynamics to ensure his victims remained silent while he continued targeting additional women within his sphere of influence. His systematic abuse included 19 separate incidents of rape and 3 incidents of sexual assault that occurred over a 3-year period, while Emeka maintained his public facade as moral leader and community advocate. The calculated nature of his crimes demonstrated premeditated predatory behavior rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or moral failure that might have been attributed to circumstantial factors. The investigation began when his 5 victims overcame enormous cultural pressure and personal trauma to report Emeka's systematic sexual abuse to South African authorities. Their decision to speak out required extraordinary courage, given the social stigma surrounding sexual assault accusations against religious leaders and the potential consequences for their community standing and access to religious support networks. The women's testimonies revealed a consistent pattern of spiritual manipulation combined with sexual assault that had been disguised as legitimate pastoral care and religious ministry. Their accounts demonstrated that Emeka had systematically exploited his position of trust to commit serious criminal offenses against congregation members who had trusted him as their spiritual guide and community advocate. The prosecution faced challenges related to cultural sensitivity and community dynamics, where religious leaders traditionally commanded enormous respect and where sexual assault victims often faced blame and ostracism rather than support and protection. However, the consistency of victim testimony and the systematic nature of Emeka's crimes provided overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The breakthrough came when investigators uncovered additional corroborating evidence that supported the victims' testimonies and demonstrated the calculated nature of Emeka's predatory behavior. The evidence showed that his assault of vulnerable women was not spontaneous misconduct, but systematic exploitation that was integral to his exercise of authority within the religious community. The 2021 High Court conviction on 19 counts of rape and 3 counts of sexual assault resulted in a 37-year prison sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the number of victims he had assaulted over the 3-year period. The court recognized that Emeka had systematically abused his position of trust and spiritual authority to commit serious criminal offenses against vulnerable women. The conviction established important precedent in South African legal system for holding religious leaders accountable for sexual assault, while demonstrating that spiritual authority provided no immunity from prosecution for criminal behavior. The severe sentence sent clear message that systematic abuse by trusted community leaders would receive punishment commensurate with the profound betrayal of trust involved. The downfall created lasting trauma within Emeka's religious community, as congregation members struggled with guilt about having trusted someone who had systematically betrayed that trust for criminal purposes. Many church members required extensive counseling and support to process the complex trauma of discovering that their spiritual father and community advocate was actually a predator who had exploited their most vulnerable members. Case 9. Waisake Tulavu. Waisake Tulavu commanded deep respect throughout Fiji's tight-knit Christian communities as a dedicated church leader whose passionate preaching and apparent spiritual devotion made him trusted figure among island families seeking authentic religious guidance in a culture where traditional customs intersected with introduced Christianity. His ministry operated within Fiji's unique social environment where extended family relationships, village connections, and religious authority created complex networks of trust and obligation that made challenging spiritual leaders both culturally difficult and potentially socially devastating. Tulavu's background reflected typical Fijian religious leadership development, combining theological training with deep understanding of local customs and community dynamics that enabled him to serve effectively as bridge between traditional island culture and modern Christian practice. His ability to communicate in both Fijian and English while understanding the specific challenges facing Pacific Islander communities made him a valuable resource for families navigating cultural transitions and spiritual questions. His church attracted primarily working-class families who viewed Tulavu as an accessible leader capable of understanding their everyday struggles with employment, family relationships, and social pressures that affected island communities dealing with economic modernization and cultural change. These congregation members trusted Tulavu not only as their pastor but also as community elder, whose guidance extended beyond spiritual matters to include practical advice about family decisions and social interactions. The congregation's faith in Tulavu was reinforced by his apparent humility and genuine concern for their well-being, as he regularly visited families during times of crisis and provided emotional support during funerals, illnesses, and other significant life events. His willingness to engage personally with congregation members' problems created strong emotional bonds that made him a central figure in their spiritual and social lives. Fiji's cultural context created particular vulnerability for religious abuse due to traditional respect for authority figures and strong cultural pressure to maintain harmony within community relationships. These dynamics made it extremely difficult for church members to question or challenge pastoral authority, especially regarding matters that might bring shame or social disruption to extended family networks that formed the foundation of island social structure. But behind Tulavu's pastoral care and community leadership lay predatory behavior that systematically targeted female church members for sexual exploitation during a concentrated period between May and September 2018. His crimes involved 3 separate women who had trusted him as their spiritual guide and sought his counsel during personal difficulties that made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation and abuse. His criminal methodology involved using legitimate pastoral interactions as opportunities to gradually introduce inappropriate physical contact, while exploiting the cultural deference that church members traditionally showed to religious authority. Tulavu convinced his victims that sexual submission to his authority was a requirement for receiving the spiritual guidance and divine intervention they desperately needed during their personal crises. The manipulation was particularly effective within Fiji's cultural context, where challenging religious leaders was viewed as both spiritually dangerous and socially disruptive, especially for women, who were expected to show respect and deference to male authority figures. Tulavu exploited these cultural expectations to ensure his victims remained silent while he continued his assault pattern against multiple women. The investigation faced unique challenges within Fiji's small island community, where maintaining social harmony was prioritized over individual justice and where exposure of religious scandal could create lasting divisions within extended family networks and village relationships. The intimate nature of island social connections meant that Tulavu's crimes affected not only his direct victims, but also their families and the broader community network. The breakthrough came when Tulavu's 3 victims overcame enormous cultural pressure and personal trauma to report his systematic sexual abuse to Fijian authorities. Their decision to speak publicly about their experiences required extraordinary courage given the potential consequences for their social standing, family relationships, and community acceptance within the tight-knit island environment. The women's testimonies revealed that Tulavu had systematically exploited his position of trust and spiritual authority to commit serious sexual offenses against congregation members who had sought his help during vulnerable periods in their lives. Their consistent accounts demonstrated that his assault pattern was calculated exploitation rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or moral failure. The prosecution had to navigate complex cultural dynamics while ensuring that victim rights were protected and that religious authority was not allowed to shield criminal behavior from appropriate legal consequences. The case required cultural sensitivity while demonstrating that traditional respect for religious leaders could not excuse systematic sexual abuse of vulnerable congregation members. The trial proceedings reflected Fiji's evolving approach to addressing sexual assault cases involving trusted community leaders, as traditional cultural patterns that protected authority figures faced challenges from modern legal standards that prioritized victim protection and criminal accountability. The case became important precedent for holding religious leaders accountable, despite their cultural authority and community standing. A conviction on charges of rape and sexual assault resulted in a 16-year prison sentence with eligibility for parole after 12 years, reflecting both the severity of Tulavu's crimes and the court's recognition that abuse of religious authority constituted an aggravating factor that warranted enhanced punishment. The sentence demonstrated judicial commitment to protecting vulnerable community members from exploitation by trusted leaders. Case 10. Oluwafemi Daniels. Oluwafemi Daniels built his ministerial reputation as a progressive Nigerian pastor who emphasized youth development and women's empowerment within his church community, presenting himself as a modern religious leader who understood contemporary challenges facing young Christians in rapidly changing African society. His apparent commitment to mentoring emerging church leaders and supporting women's ministry made him a trusted figure among families seeking spiritual guidance that honored both traditional values and progressive social development. Daniel's ministry operated within Nigeria's competitive religious landscape, where charismatic pastors competed for influence and resources while claiming divine revelation and supernatural abilities that would attract followers and generate financial support. His focus on youth ministry and leadership development distinguished him from prosperity gospel preachers who emphasized material wealth, making him appealing to educated families seeking authentic spiritual guidance rather than financial manipulation. His church attracted primarily young adults and families who viewed Daniels as an accessible leader, capable of understanding their struggles with career development, relationship decisions, and spiritual questions that traditional religious authorities often failed to address. With cultural sensitivity and practical wisdom, these congregation members trusted Daniels, not only as their pastor, but also as mentor, whose guidance could help them navigate complex decisions about education, marriage, and professional development. The ministry's emphasis on developing emerging leaders created numerous opportunities for Daniels to establish close mentoring relationships with young church members who sought his guidance about spiritual calling and ministry preparation. His reputation for supporting women's leadership development was particularly appealing to female church members who had been marginalized by traditional religious structures that limited their participation and leadership opportunities. Daniel's apparent progressive attitudes about gender equality and women's empowerment created a facade of enlightened leadership that concealed systematic exploitation of the very women he claimed to support and develop. His methodology involved identifying young female church members who showed leadership potential or spiritual dedication and offering them special mentoring opportunities that provided access to advanced ministry training and leadership development. But behind his progressive rhetoric and youth-centric ministry lay predatory behavior that systematically targeted the young women he was supposed to mentor and protect. His crimes involved using his position of trust and spiritual authority to sexually assault women who had sought his guidance about their spiritual calling and ministry development, betraying their trust in the most devastating way possible. The criminal pattern emerged in his exploitation of a 23-year-old assistant pastor who had joined his ministry team, seeking opportunities to develop her leadership skills and deepen her understanding of pastoral ministry. Daniels used his mentoring relationship with her to gradually introduce inappropriate physical contact, while convincing her that sexual submission to his authority was requirement for receiving the spiritual advancement and ministry opportunities she desperately wanted. His methodology involved systematic grooming that began with legitimate pastoral interactions and gradually escalated to sexual assault disguised as spiritual ministry or leadership development. Daniels convinced his victim that physical intimacy with him was sacred ritual that would enhance her spiritual sensitivity and prepare her for higher levels of ministry responsibility and divine revelation. The manipulation extended to include a 19-year-old church member who had sought Daniels's guidance about her spiritual development and potential ministry calling. His systematic exploitation of both women demonstrated calculated predatory behavior that used spiritual manipulation and professional mentoring opportunities to facilitate sexual assault while maintaining his public image as progressive leader and women's advocate. The investigation began when both victims overcame enormous cultural pressure and personal trauma to report Daniels' systematic sexual abuse to Nigerian authorities. Their decision to speak publicly about their experiences required extraordinary courage, given the social stigma surrounding sexual assault accusations against religious leaders and the potential consequences for their ministry careers and community standing. The women's testimonies revealed that Daniels had used sophisticated psychological manipulation that combined spiritual authority with professional mentoring to create environments where sexual assault could occur while victims were convinced they were participating in legitimate ministry development. Their consistent accounts demonstrated systematic exploitation rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment or moral failure. The prosecution presented evidence that Daniels had systematically abused his position of trust and spiritual authority to commit serious sexual offenses against young women who had trusted him as their pastor and mentor. His defense attempts to characterize the sexual contact as consensual relationships failed when confronted with testimony demonstrating the power dynamics and spiritual manipulation that made genuine consent impossible. The breakthrough came when investigators uncovered additional evidence of Daniels' systematic manipulation and grooming techniques that demonstrated his predatory methodology was calculated and premeditated rather than spontaneous misconduct. The evidence showed that his assault of vulnerable young women was integral to his exercise of authority within the mentoring relationships he established. The 2024 conviction on charges of rape and sexual assault resulted in life imprisonment for the rape conviction, plus an additional 3-year sentence for sexual assault, to be served concurrently. The severe sentence reflected both the court's recognition of the profound betrayal involved when spiritual mentors exploit those seeking guidance and the systematic nature of Daniels' criminal behavior. The court's decision to impose life imprisonment demonstrated judicial recognition that abuse of mentoring relationships by religious leaders constituted particularly serious criminal behavior that warranted maximum punishment under Nigerian law. The sentence sent clear message that claims of spiritual authority or progressive leadership provided no immunity from prosecution for systematic sexual exploitation. The downfall destroyed not only Daniels' ministry but also created lasting trauma within Nigeria's progressive Christian community as young people struggled with questions about trusting religious leaders who claimed to support their development and empowerment. Many emerging female leaders required extensive counseling to process the complex trauma of discovering that someone they had viewed as advocate and mentor was actually a predator. The devastating pattern that emerges from these 10 cases reveals a global epidemic of religious predators who systematically exploit the sacred trust placed in spiritual leaders across every continent and culture. What makes these cases particularly chilling is the sophisticated manipulation techniques these predators employed to exploit universal human needs for spiritual guidance, community belonging, and divine intervention. These 10 cases serve as urgent warning about the dangers of unchecked religious authority and the devastating consequences when spiritual leaders exploit the sacred trust placed in them by vulnerable people seeking divine guidance and community support. Which of these shocking cases disturbed you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this investigation into religious predators who betrayed sacred trust opened your eyes to the dark reality of spiritual exploitation, make sure to subscribe to Savage Case Files for more explosive true crime documentaries that expose those who abuse positions of power and authority. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when we drop our next shocking investigation into corruption, betrayal, and criminal behavior by those society trusts most.